Fórum de Investimentos Brasil 2022. Keynote Session, Economia Global. Sir Martin Sorrell, Chair da S4 Capital.
Muito bem, o FMI.
IMF estimates that the global GDP has grown by 5.9% in 2021, reverting the losses from 2020 when the economy recoiled by 13.1%. However, the global scenario still suffers with a lot of factors of instability such as global inflation, the elevation of prices of oil, as well as military conflict between Russia and Ukraine. In this keynote session, the Brazil Investment Forum 2021 welcomes now the Executive President of Export Capital, Martin Sorrell, to deal with the main economic perspectives on a global level. To moderate this conversation, we count with a special guest, Greg Barton, who is the inventor, creator, and CEO of BIF Americas. So now we hand the floor to the moderator, Mr. Greg Barton.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our fireside chat. There's no fire, but I'm assuming we're going to have one or two fireworks with our invited guest here. Thank you very much for being here. I think we're going to have a very interesting and insightful half an hour. My name is Greg Barton. I'm the founder and CEO of BIF Americas. BIF Americas is a data and technology company. We're based in Chile, but with presence all over Latin America. And we provide must-have news, data, and analytics on multiple industries, many of which we've talked about this morning. And we cover projects, investments, mergers and acquisitions, regulatory environment, political and economic risk to inform our clients about how to make better informed decisions and to win and save and make money in Latin America. I'd like to also mention the fact that we're about 180 people today, very talented, very professional team, based here in Brazil, also in 10 other countries in Latin America. And we work with our private equity partners, Endicott Capital in the US. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here today. I'd like to thank ApexBrasil for inviting me. And for me personally, it's a special honor to have met Sir Martin and been able to chat to him yesterday.
You did an extremely good advertisement for BizNews. Let's get into it.
Let's get into it. I'm getting there.
Let's forget about the introductions and get stuck in.
Okay, but I do want to tell people how I knew of you, because not everyone probably knows this, but when I was 20, in 1987, Martin Sorrell, Richard Branson, and Alan Sugar were the guys. They were the entrepreneurs in the UK, and if you were a 20-year-old like I was, they were the guys you looked up to. And he probably doesn't know this, but he was a mentor and he was a role model for me and many others entrepreneurs in my generation. So I just want to thank you for that. But yeah, let's get on with it.
Let's get into it. Yeah?
Okay, I'm on it.
Because everybody, the moral of this story is don't follow the president and the finance minister.
Well, that's what I'm going to ask you in a moment.
Yeah.
You don't want me to do any of your intro, your bio?
No, let's get on to it.
Okay. I do want to say one thing, though, that you did say, just to give you an idea of the passion of this man. When he had WPP, which you all know became the largest advertising company in the world, he was quoted as saying, what happens at WPP is not a matter of life and death to me. It's far more important than that. I mean, that sums him up.
But that actually is a quote, as we're in Brazil, there was a famous football manager of Liverpool, whose name was Bill Shankly. And he said, football is not a matter of life and death, it's more important than that. So that was
Yeah, you did plagiarize it, okay.
Right.
So Martin, let's jump into it then. S4, you could have retired. I mean, when you left WPP, you were 72, I believe. Most of us probably would have thought about retiring or playing a bit more cricket in your case, but you didn't. You decided to start up another company, very different company, same industry, but 100% digital advertising and data marketing. Why?
Well, I think there's a really interesting, I certainly didn't want to play golf. Golf has become very popular, particularly in the Middle East recently. We'll get into that because I think that's an interesting little straw in the wind about what's happening in the world. But there are various growth sectors, and here we are in Latin America, in Brazil, and it's really the digital economy or the media economy in Latin America and indeed Brazil is very different to what you see around the world. I mean, really you have two worlds in the media economy, an analog world which has gone ex-growth, and a digital world which even during the COVID year of 2020 grew by around 10 or 15%. We grew, our organic growth rate in that year was about 20%. So whilst the overall media industry was down, let's say 5 or 10%, digital still grew. In Latin America, digital is only about 30% of the media market. Globally, it's 60%. It's forecast to grow here in Brazil and in Latin America this year by about 2 or 3 times the rate of traditional media. So the answer to your question is, Greg, it is that digital provided a growth opportunity. I believe you're best pushing on an open door, identifying sectors of the economy where there is growth, and we'll get into that in the context of the world economy in a minute. So that's number one. Number two, data has become, you could say, the new form of energy, the new oil, and that drives the development of content, of digital content, and its distribution through digital media. And we have what we call a holy trinity model of data driving insights into content and distributing it through digital media in a continuous loop. The third thing is we come to the market in what we call faster, better, cheaper. Faster is about agility. Everybody in this room is facing short-term changes of considerable magnitude. And I know every CEO says their organization is agile and facile and responds quickly to changes. But agility is the key corporate attribute. Better is about understanding the digital ecosystem, and we can get into the companies that dominate that. And cheaper is about efficiency, particularly in an inflationary environment. And the final fundamental principle was you had a unitary structure. The holding companies, such as WPP, which I was involved in building, tend to be very vertically organized in different brands that really don't work together as one P&L, as one operation, and that's critically important too. So the answer to your question is, didn't want to retire. I had a point to prove about growth and finding growth, and that's why we started 4 years ago from zero, and today we now have 9,000 people in 33 countries, or 32 actually. We've withdrawn from Russia, so it's actually 32, and the geographical split is about 70% in North and South America, about 20% in EMEA, and 10% in Asia, with an objective post-Ukraine, post the war, because I think the dynamics have now changed, to be about 60% North and South America, about 20% Europe or EMEA, and 20% in Asia Pacific. From a functional point of view, we're 60% content, about 30% data and digital media, and about 10% technological services. Again, the objective there would be 50, 25, 25 in terms of growth.
Thank you. So you've built a formidable staff here in South America.
Yeah, we have about 3,500 people in South America. Maybe just talk about, and I think what Paulo Guedes said, the finance minister said, was right on point. I think one message for the participants here is that the world has changed. He touched on it, and I think the president touched on it as well. But whereas pre-pandemic, and you know, if you and I, Greg, were having this conversation 3 or 4 months ago, it would have been a very difficult conversation, a very different conversation. Since January the 1st, we've been faced really with a perfect storm. We started off with withdrawal of COVID stimulus. The fiscal and monetary stimulus in the world economy was something like, it must have been about 10 or 15 trillion. The world is about 92 trillion of GDP, and it was about 10 to 15, so a huge sort of Keynesian stimulus, which Larry Summers warned would be inflationary. Larry Summers, a liberal economist, a Keynesian economist, more of the center-left, but warned against Biden overspending in the US administration. But number one, withdrawal of the stimulus. Number two, inflation because of that increased spending during COVID. Number three, the rise in interest rates as a result of the withdrawal of the stimulus. Number four, the war in Ukraine, which changes the defense dynamics very seriously. And number five, probably the extended Chinese lockdowns. All of those, and it was headlined in the introduction to this session, 3 months ago, 4 months ago, we were looking at a world that was growing this year at about 4 to 5%. Now the World Bank is talking, and I'm sure the Inter-American Development Bank is similar, is forecasting a world that will grow at something less than 3% this year and 1.5% to 2% at most next year. So we're in a seriously different world. And I think people talk about deglobalization. Larry Fink at BlackRock has talked about that for some time. I think he's right in the sense that global GDP growth is going to be very different. And it's going to be significantly less than we've seen in the free trade era stemming from the 1980s through to 2020s. So over the last 40 years, we basically had a world that was certainly reducing tariffs, reducing sanctions, stimulating free trade. That is going to be a very different dynamic. The war in Ukraine, I think, marks a very significant change. And most of the people in this room are running companies that are global or running parts of companies that are global. And I think it's worth talking a little bit about what are the dynamics of change. And if you're in the investment business, and if I use an investment analogy, risk on, risk off, as you look at the world during these five things that I referred to, from withdrawal of stimulus, inflation, interest rates, the war, Chinese lockdowns, what's the impact of that? Number one, if you think about risk on for a minute, the areas of the world that look more attractive in this slower growth environment. The first, I would say, would be North and South America. And again, Paulo Guedes referred to this. I think he's right on point here, that the offshoring and nearshoring opportunities in South America are absolutely huge. One of the reasons why we have 3,500 people out of 9,000 people in Latin America is we're extremely bullish on Latin America as a whole, and I would say we're raging bulls about the four principal economies we operate in are Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico, but similarly bullish about the rest of Latin America. That time zone of North and South America and the nearshoring and offshoring opportunities are hugely important given what's happening in the world from a security point of view. So you look at the war, risk on in North and South America. I was talking to one or two of the ambassadors here from the Middle East. Certainly risk on in Middle East, people don't understand that with the surge in oil prices, the increase in wealth in the Middle East has been hugely increased. If you double or triple your net worth in literally months, that has a huge impact on wealth and wealth development. And the third, so that would be risk on. I would say Africa generally would be certainly risk on, but the volatility in Africa and the difficulty, I mean, Africa really is 57 or so different molecules moving in different directions. That makes it quite difficult, but certainly the Middle East risk on. And then Asia, ex-China. Again, Paulo Guedes referred to this. I think probably I would differ a little bit with the president of the Inter-American Development Bank. I think we tend to get a little bit maybe too aggressive in our language around China. I think it's wrong to talk about China diminishing, but certainly given what's happening in the Ukraine, questions are raised from a security point of view and an investment point of view, given Taiwan and the potential situation around Taiwan.
I doubt whether the Chinese will move on Taiwan until the semiconductor issue has been sorted out. 85 to 90% of the world's semiconductors come from Taiwan, and throttling that supply of semiconductors from a security and investment industrial point of view would be a serious thing, and I think the Chinese would back off doing anything until the supply chain around semiconductors was in place. So risk on, North and South America, the Middle East, and then Asia ex-China, India, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines are all areas I think that are going to benefit. Risk off, where I think there would be diminished investment, is certainly going to be Europe, certainly Central and Eastern Europe. The security situation there, even if there is a peace in Ukraine, which I doubt. I mean, I think the war in Ukraine will continue for a significant period of time. And absent any regime change in Russia, I think the security situation in Central and Eastern Europe is going to be very difficult. We've already seen clients switching their supply chains and nearshore and offshoring operations away from Central and Eastern Europe to Asia, ex-China, as I said, India, Vietnam, etc., and to North and South America, particularly South America. So we're already starting to see. So that's one set of geographic conclusions. The other thing I just want to touch on is on technology. The other thing that the war has underlined, in my view, is the importance of technology. When you see countries investing now in defense, Germany, for example, will invest about 4% of its GDP in defense investments. When they talk about defense, they're not just talking about missiles or military personnel or military equipment. They're talking about cyber. And the importance of a strong technological base to the economy from a defense point of view is critically important. So when you look at those 5 forces that the president talked about, the finance minister talked about, the president of the Inter-American Development Bank talked about, that perfect storm that I think we're going through, it will be difficult, but companies' strategies are going to be much more varied. They're going to be very much more regional in a generally slower growth environment with higher fuel prices, higher commodity prices, making pressure on margins. So there's going to be much more careful selection of where you expand. So overall, slower growth, but the dynamics on a regional basis is very different. So the era of globalization probably gone, and a very much greater focus on regionalization and differentiation, as Ged has said, and I think that's a big opportunity for South America.
Well, they did warn me about this. You've just answered every question I had.
Good.
So thank you for that. So that's the end of this. No, that was, well, obviously hugely interesting, and you really did answer a few of my questions there. So it's quite clear, I think we've all been listening to it, and we all know as CEOs dealing with what we have to deal with today, this is probably the worst economic scenario we've been in. You mentioned regionalization. What else should CEOs, people like the leaders in this room and the leaders connected online, Sir Martin, what should they be thinking about? What advice would you give us?
I think there are 3 things that certainly, we're involved, our business is involved in 3 functions: the marketing function, the sales function, and the IT function. When we talk about digital transformation, any CEO, the CEOs in this room and beyond, would be involving their marketing people, their sales people, and their IT people. And we hit all of those 3 functions, and they come together. And there are three areas that I think CEOs should, and those people in those functions, the chief marketing officer, chief sales officer, CIO, CTO, should think about. The first is agility. I touched on it before. Everybody says their organizations are highly responsive, highly agile. Now, I'm sure that everybody in this room follows that principle, but they would be the exceptions to the rule. Organizations do not move sufficiently quickly in a world that is increasingly dominated by short-term developments. So an emphasis on agility, not just making speeches about it, but getting organizations, I mean, our clients, just run through them. Our biggest client is Alphabet, so Google. Our second biggest client is NDA, but it's the biggest telecommunication company in the world. It's probably the second most valuable company on the planet. You can guess who that is. Our third would be Meta or Facebook. Our fourth would be BMW Mini. Our fifth would be Mondelez. Our sixth would be HP. Our seventh is NDA. It's one of the big FMCG companies, very active in South America. Our eighth is also NDA. It is an American financial institution, a substantial one. And then Amazon and PayPal, T-Mobile. So you get those are the top 10 or 11. You get the drift. So agility is extremely key. And the tech companies, even with the market meltdown that we've seen in the last sort of 3 to 6 months, even with that meltdown, the tech companies, 50% of our revenues come from tech, tend to be more agile. So one thing would be agility. The second thing is take back control. I'm using a phrase that was the tagline for the Brexit campaign. I was not a Brexiteer, I was a Remainer. I was disappointed with the British electorate's decision, but the people have spoken and democracy at work. But their tagline was take back control. And I think the same thing applies to those people running companies in the marketing, sales, and IT function. Unfortunately, after the great financial crisis, there was I'm sitting here in Brazil, and zero-based budgeting, although it wasn't a new concept, was a concept that a company like 3G, for example, Paulo Lehmann, implemented very heavily in his empire, in his companies, to reduce cost. And I agree with it in principle, but what it tended to do was to get companies to outsource a lot of their activity at precisely the time, from a marketing and sales point of view, when they should be internalizing it. When things are moving at light speed, at 24/7, always on dynamics, you have to have internally content and data operations that you can work with. You know, gone are the days when you could brief an agency and over a 2 or 3 month period produce an expensive television commercial to execute. So I would say the second thing is internalizing. You know, we have 3 models: the outsource model, the embedded model where we put people into clients, and then in-house model. So I would say that's the second area. And the third, and this is really, I think, interesting and important because there are political comparisons here. The political election model that has been very successful in recent elections around not just traditional media, social media, has been a highly targeted model that looks at what the electorate or consumers, how they are thinking, how they are behaving, what their media habits are, what their sales and purchase habits are. And there have been 2 fundamental changes in recent months, in recent years. The first is Apple's decision around IDFA, the restrictions that they've made in relation to individualized information. And the second is Google's decision around third-party cookies. They've effectively nixed third-party sources of data. So 2 sources of data are critically important in dealing not just with business to consumers, but business to business. The first is first-party data. That's the data that you have, for example, in business news, of your customers, what they're doing, what they're watching, what they're reading, what they're buying. So that's one source. And the second source is the signals from the platforms. So the big issue for our clients is how do they integrate all their first-party data platforms inside their company? Because many of the companies in this room have grown by acquisition, or they've had different people in different parts of the organization doing different things, and you want to bring them together. So I would say those 3 things: agility, take back control, and then the importance of mining the data, bringing together the data in a comprehensive form, and using that data directly with consumers, with the signals from the platforms. And there are really 6 platforms that dominate the world technologically: Google, Alphabet, Facebook, Meta, Amazon, Alibaba, Tencent, and TikTok, part of ByteDance. Those 6 platforms, last year, digital advertising was about 450 billion. Google did about 215. Facebook, Meta did 115, and Amazon did 30. So that's about 360 out of 450 out of the 3 Western platforms, excluding what was going on in China through Alibaba, Tencent, TikTok. So those platforms dominate, and you see that struggle, for example, here in Brazil, between traditional media, e.g. Globo, and you see it happening with Televisa in Mexico, and with the growth of the platforms. So those would be the areas that I would focus on.
And do you spend a lot of time on TikTok?
I don't personally do, but what is amazing, and I think we have to be very careful about the rhetoric surrounding, you see it very much from the US administration, the anti-Chinese rhetoric. Everybody in this room who deals with China knows that the best way to make progress with the Chinese is not to criticize them in public. It's amazing, if you sit down with them privately, face to face, you can tell them exactly what's on your mind. My experience has always been, don't criticize publicly, but engage privately, and that way they do listen. They not only are polite, but they do listen and they do react. But I think the rhetoric has to be reduced, because for everybody in this room and anybody outside this room who's listening, there are 2 big issues that we have to resolve. The first is what happens around Russia, because the security position in Central and Eastern Europe, even if, let's say for a minute that the Russians took the Donbass and Crimea, and let's say that the war, there was a bad peace agreement, some call it, on that basis, the question remains, what would be Russia's expansionist plans in Central and Eastern Europe? It was few days ago, President Putin celebrated the 350th anniversary of Peter the Great. And he drew comparisons to what's going on recently in the Ukraine and what happened with Sweden then, and indeed Estonia and Latvia. That's one big issue. The second big issue is, whether we like it or not, the relationships between the US and China. If those relationships remain fractured, and Brazil is a $1.5 trillion economy. Latin America is $3.5 trillion. The world is 92 trillion. The US is 24 trillion, and the Chinese economy is 14 trillion. 38 trillion out of 92 is in 2 economies. We can't afford, I think, to have the 2 biggest economies in the world at loggerheads. And I don't see a solution to Ukraine and Russia at the moment, and I don't see a solution to the US-China split. And those 2 things, I think, are the biggest drags on economic growth and the biggest questions around. So those 2 things, everybody in this room should really sort of focus on what can be done to deal with those 2 issues.
Yeah, very interesting. I'm sure that's for another session, and maybe you'll get into that in the panel after this. But let's come back to technology, if we may. So you mentioned the changes, the dynamic, obviously the pandemic changed business and changed consumers' habits. What do you think in the next 5 to 10 years could be the biggest, what will have the biggest impact, technologically speaking?
Well, the regulatory framework in the West, and indeed the East, in recent years, has been to bash technology. It's amazing how many people in many situations blame the rise of technology and the rise of social media for all the ills. But given what we're going through at the minute, given the sustainability challenges that we face, whether it be in the Amazon or elsewhere, given the the rise in energy prices, given the rise in commodity prices, both of which are likely to continue for significant periods of time, when you try and find, I'm 77 years old, and I've gone through, you mentioned 1987, I can go back to the oil crises of the 1970s and the 1980s, which what we're going through at the minute probably are most like. I can go through the internet bust of 2002. I can go through the crisis of 1991 to 2008, COVID. All of these things, when you went through them, you sort of saw a way out. I think at the moment, what I really worry about with those 5 things that I went through earlier, I don't see the way out. When I talk about Russia and security in Central and Eastern Europe, when I talk about US-China, there doesn't seem to be the leadership at the moment, maybe we will see it, that will enable us to get out of it. So when you ask me the question, I think technology has been bashed and regulated very significantly in the last 2 or 3 years. I think we're witnessing a change. I think you see in both the West and the East, the Chinese government, for example, put heavy restrictions on gaming, on the education sector, in terms of digital education, a year or so ago, and caused severe drop in valuations. I think as a result of the war, and as a result probably of COVID too, the importance of technological development and technological advances has just been underlined. So I think, actually, it's interesting. I think regulatory pressure, you're already starting to see a bit in China along those lines. You've heard some statements from the Chinese government, from key ministers, that the regulations they're putting in the gaming sector and other sectors might be relaxed. I think you'll start to see that. I think the regulation in the West, although there is some continuation, will be relaxed because the importance of it. With the way, how are we going to deal with inflation? All very well putting up interest rates to try and choke it out, but I think it is going to be with us for a significant period of time, and the way you deal with it in a sophisticated economy is further technological development. So it's not just the big boys. I mean, it's not just the 6 I mentioned. It's not just Apple and Microsoft. It's not just Adobe or Oracle or Salesforce. Oracle reported their results last night. Very interesting, very strong in a market that was going through a tremendous correction. Stock was up strongly last night on very strong results, underlining the importance of digital software transformation at times like this. So technology will be really important in improving. So it's not just those companies, it's IBM and SAP, it's Twitter, it's Snap, it's Pinterest, it's LG, it's Samsung, it's Epic Games, it's Riot Games, it's Kaohsiung, it's Spotify, it's Netflix, it's Shopify. And Brazil is very interesting because the Chinese companies, Shopee, for example, Kwai, have all made inroads, Shine, have all made very strong inroads here in the economy. And so they will be forces, I think, in the future to come. So technological sophistication and development, I think, will be one of the ways that we focus on.
Very interesting. And globalization was mentioned. And given the importance of that across the globe, do you think globalization is over?
Well, I said before, I think it is certainly slowed. The globalization, there was a professor at the Harvard Business School called Ted Levitt, who wrote an article in Harvard Business Review in October of 1983. It's a bit like Paolo Guedes quoting Alan Greenspan from chapter 23 or whatever it was of his book.
The Age of
That
Turbulence.
was a seminal article. What he said was, and he over-egged the point to make the point. He admitted later that he did that. But what he said was consumers were going to consume everything in the same way everywhere. That, because of individualization, because of the data that we can now get about consumers or their habits, when they buy, how they buy, where they buy, that is now much more specialized and much more targeted. So I think it is going to be changed. I don't know whether you can say it's completely over, But my view is, and it's difficult for the people in this room. I mean, coming out of COVID, everybody in this room had two big benefits from COVID. Office costs were down and T&E was down. So margins actually expanded in 2019 and 2020. 2020 and 2021. And in 21, the stimulus that I referred to, the $10 to $15 trillion stimulus to the world economy, expanded it still further. Coming out of COVID, we have all these economic headwinds, and everybody is faced with return to the office, maybe not in whole, but in part, and increased travel, so back to normal. So pressures on margins are going to be huge, plus commodity price increases. So, one of our clients I was talking to recently said they'd increased their prices, this is packaged goods, had increased their prices by 30% in the last year. That can't continue forever. This is in a fast-moving consumer goods, low-ticket area. That can't continue. So everybody in this room, coming back to your question about where they focus, is going to have to focus on how to be more efficient. Enterprises are going to have to look at how they transform. The irony is people don't transform when things are going well. They transform when times get tougher, right? So I think the Oracle results were really interesting in that context. What it tells you is that enterprises are investing much more heavily in software and software development, marketing being the area that we're interested in.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's the marketing and sales tech stack, which is going crazy at the moment for just the reasons you were saying.
Well, the change agents inside companies. I mean, everybody in this room, when things are going well, it's human nature to say, don't change. Think if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The irony is that you only start to deal with some of those fundamental issues when things get tough. And I don't want to be depressing, but I want to be realistic. And I think the finance minister, Geddes, was very realistic about it. I mean, I think he pitched it perfectly, which is the world might be a more difficult place, but for reasons that we've just discussed around what's happening from a security point of view, the relative attractiveness, differentiation of Latin America and Brazil in particular, being half of the Latin American GDP and the dominant economy, that becomes even more attractive on a relative basis. So huge opportunity. And one other thing I should say, what I don't think the world ex-LATAM understands is the quality of the people here. We find, from a technological point of view and creative point of view, absolutely outstanding people. We have the Cannes Festival next week in France, which tends to be dominated by US, UK, French, German, Italian, Spanish agencies. Over time, we've seen increasingly strong creative output, particularly, I would say, from Argentina and Brazil. I would call those two countries out particularly, from Buenos Aires and Sao Paulo. And that's grown in leaps and bounds. But that's now spreading. And, Duque, for example, in Colombia, before he will leave power in Colombia shortly, but I remember he has a program for 50,000 software engineers in Bogota. We have in Buenos Aires over 1,000 people. Here in Sao Paulo and San Carlos is a university town, we have 1,500 people. I mean, these are all very sophisticated, very strong, very well educated, technically strong, highly creative people. And I don't think it's quite understood. The same thing applies to Mexico City. Same thing applies to Bogota, as I've said, to Sao Paulo, San Carlos, and what we see in Buenos Aires.
So why are others not seeing what you're seeing and what we all see?
Well, I think it is happening. I think, you know, for example, we compete with a company called Globant, very successful, started in Buenos Aires. They have about 20,000 people, so about double the size of us. They have about 5,000 people in Argentina and 5,000 people in Colombia. So I think you're starting to see nearshoring, offshoring in tech, and indeed creative, gain ground. This is not necessarily for selling in South America. This can be for selling in North America or globally. So these are hubs that are extremely effective.
Very interesting. And then we're coming towards the end. I just want to talk to you. You're sourcing staff here, you're sourcing talent here. Yeah. We all know how good that is. What about business? How important is Brazil going to be for you in the next 5 years?
Well, I think it's very important. I mean, if I think about we've built 3 businesses here. One was the Sarches, one WPP, and now with S4. And, you know, our emphasis is slightly different here now because we're in 32 countries. As I said, we're 70% North and South America, and I think given what's happened recently economically and security-wise, North and South America North and South America could well become the dominant pillar along with Asia Pacific. And then maybe in the middle, you have the Middle East. I mean, I really want to emphasize, and I don't think we fully understand what's happened in the last few months from a Middle Eastern point of view. And I made light of the golf tournament, the LIV golf tournament that's just, upended the PGA. But that's the Sovereign Wealth Fund, BIF, funding that. And that's just a straw in the wind about the changes that are taking place. Now, we're at the beginning. So what we're doing here is trying to harness the difference this time around, the third time around, is we're harnessing the talent here, and it's basically 2 buckets, tech talent and creative talent, and trying to leverage that talent elsewhere in the world. Very, very much in sync with what the ministers said. I mean, every minister touched on this. You can call it nearshoring or offshoring, and Getty has got it absolutely right. I mean, we've seen several clients. Well, let me put it like this. If we were on the board of a company and we were at a board meeting and a recommendation came for an investment in Central and Eastern Europe, what would we say? We would probably, we're not now. If we were China, Taiwan, not now. Now, I think Europe as a whole is facing significant issues. That would not be the case, I think, for North and South America. That would not be the case for the Middle East. Africa, as I said, is much more difficult to gauge because of the volatility, political volatility and other volatility, corruption too. But basically, things have changed from it. So I think there's a big advantage to the region.
Wow, that's very relieving to hear, and I think we all agree with you, but to see it in such an important light, in your eyes, is fantastic. I'm not going to try or even attempt to summarize that masterclass from Sir Martin. I think he did it very well on his own. I believe you've got a video you'd like to show.
Well, I think we have, would you believe we had a technological problem?
There you go. The beauty of technology.
Maybe during the course of the panel we can get it done, but we are going to show it online.
Okay.
So if there's anybody out there, but if anybody in the audience wants to write to me, I know that Q&A is verboten, is forbidden, which is a shame because you've got a lot of expertise in the room. But anybody wants to want Martin, my email address is martin@s4capital.com, capital.com. So I'd love to hear from anybody in the audience or anybody out there in the ether. If there is anybody out there on YouTube, we'll be showing it on YouTube, I'm assured.
Excellent. And Martin, just one last word from you. What would you, as you leave the Brazil Investment Fund, I know you're staying for the next panel, but one word for us here, what would it be?
One word?
Well, one sentence.
Well, I think, look, the thing that frustrates us most in dealing with clients is this lack of agility. I know it's really easy to say, and
we would be guilty in our own organization of lacking agility. But on the assumption that everybody in this room is a CEO, what goes on in what they say is going on and what actually goes on tends to be two different things. And the more established an organization is, the more analog it is. That tends to be the case. So, for example, when clients are choosing agencies, of which we're one, they often take 6 months or 12 months to make a decision. That cannot be right in a market that is moving literally at the speed of light. So organizations, in what we're going through, I just go on too long about it, but there was a really interesting interview with Henry Kissinger just recently. And he said the big difference between his time when he was with President Nixon and today is everything has gone short term. That leadership is very much about adapting to short-term changes. Whereas hitherto with Adenauer and Nixon and Margaret Thatcher is much more long-term. I think that's true in the business environment. So just try and ensure that your organizations move at light speed, because if you don't, you really get caught out. Look at the changes that have happened in the last 4 months. It's absolutely incredible. Look at the volatility in the stock markets. Look whilst we've been here in Sao Paulo, look at the correction that's been taking place in the stock market. So in dealing with those changes and dealing with the long-term implications of them, you're going to have to move it. It's 24/7, always on.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Sir Martin Sorrell.
Nossos sinceros.
Like really to thank Mr. Sorrell and Barton for moderating the panel, and I would like to invite everyone to follow on the first theme panel, whose theme is the economy understanding trends and pointing towards opportunity. Coming up next.
Eu sou a usina hidrelétrica de Itaipu.
I am Itaipu Power Plant. I am the fruit of a union of two ports. And this powerful gathering generated so much energy that I am able to propel a great part of Brazil and almost all of Paraguay. I light up, I transform, I integrate development in respect to the environment, in the protection of the riparian forests, rivers, and springs, in the creation of biological refuge, and in the care towards the future. To this day, I am the power plant that has produced more clean and renewable energy on the planet, and I capture a great amount of CO2 from the atmosphere. I sequestrate, preserving the native forests and biodiversity with all the power that I can generate. I am Itaipu Binacional. I am more than energy. I am sustainable development.
Innovation is in our DNA. This is how we expand the limits of knowledge and our technological frontiers for discovering, developing, and producing in various giant oil fields in ultra-deep water, in a complex production operation, confirming our technical capacity and global leadership, all with maximum production efficiency and lower carbon emissions. This is energy for transformation.